Now we'll talk about the development side of Orchard. We will also write our own theme and module, but first we'll take a look at the Orchard source code, because, you know, Orchard is open source, you always have the source at your hands as a reference, and there are a lot of examples, a lot of interesting things that you can learn from. So let's take a look. You can get the source from the Orchard GitHub, of course. You can either clone it, or you can download it right away as a zip file. I have it downloaded here, and it's also built, so let's check it out. This is the Orchard solution, and by the way, the solution itself, the folder of the solution itself looks like this. And the solution itself looks like this. Here you have the solution folder. There are, of course, a lot of metadata files. There is also the license of Orchard. Do keep in mind that while Orchard is free and open source, you can't just use it without any restrictions. There are just a couple of restrictions, and those are elaborated in the license file. And you also have two folders here, the source folder and the test folder. These are the ones that we'll actually take a look at, but we will take a look at from the solution by opening the solution in Visual Studio, and that you can open from the SLN file, of course. Although I'm using Visual Studio on Windows here, you are not really tied to Visual Studio. You can use any other IDE on Windows as well as on other operating systems. You know, it's .NET Core, it's cross-platform, use whatever you like. And what you have in the solution, well, a couple of nice folders. And there's actually there are actually a few things that you haven't seen on the file system. The build folder is not really interesting day to day, but the docs folder is, because this is actually the Orchard documentation. So this project here, as you can see, actually contains the documentation that you can see on the web. The Orchard documentation website is an open source application, as well as a bunch of also open source markdown files. So all of the pages here, like this getting started page, is the Orchard documentation site is also open source. In the end, it's a bunch of also open source markdown and other metadata files that you can also contribute to. And everything is here right at your fingertips in the solution too. And that's quite useful because, well, first of all, you can contribute to it. And as I mentioned, as a newcomer, your contributions are not just especially welcome, but also especially useful to everybody else. Because when you are new to Orchard, you can notice things that people who have been working with the system for a while just won't notice. But your experience matters a lot. So please consider contributing to the documentation. And well, you can also do that quickly from GitHub, but you can also do that from the full solution, and everything is here. And secondly, it's not just for contribution, but also for reference. So when you are searching for something in the Orchard source code, like how to use that piece of API, how to utilize that method in my own module or theme, then you can quickly search the full Orchard source code for examples. And the documentation has annotated examples as well. So at a quick glance, you will get a nice overview of various Orchard examples. Now, apart from the documentation, of course, we have the full source code of the application itself here, which is in the SRC or source folder. There are also various folders that, again, we don't really need right now. Just do know that Orchard, of course, has automated tests too, which are in the test folder. And by the way, this folder structure is quite common generally, and quite common in the Orchard core community as well. So you may notice that if you find other Orchard solutions, they will have the same or a similar structure. Now, what we have here, for example, in the source folder, well, a lot of folders and this Orchard Course CMS.web project. And this is kind of the root project here, because this is the actual web project that drives the web application. And Orchard is added to that web project. Because, you know, when you start an Orchard application, what you're actually doing is that you are creating a web app, and then you add Orchard to it. And this is actually what's also here, but this is the full source code in its source form, not with NuGet packages. And what we have in this project is very similar to what you will see in your own generated templated web project. And we can also take a look at what's on the file system here. So let's quickly check it out. Here we see the folders in the web project, and these will be pretty much the same in your own application too. I would just emphasize one, which is the app data folder. This is a fully set up application. This is actually a different one than what we have used, because well, this is the full source code. And what we see here is that there is a tenant.json file. Remember that we talked about multi-tenancy and how even if you don't actively use multi-tenancy, Orchard still uses it behind the scenes, and even if you don't create multiple tenants, there will be at least one tenant, the default tenant. Now, all the tenants' details by default are stored in this file. Check it out if you are interested. One more interesting thing here is the logs folder. We don't yet have anything here because there were no errors, but we'll see during module development how you can write to the log. In any case, if there is some error in Orchard, check out the logs. Most possibly, the logs will contain useful information for debugging. And we also have the sites folder here. Sites folder here is tightly related to the tenants file, and well, it contains details for all the tenants. Since we only have a single tenant here, and as we discussed, the default tenant is called default, we just have a folder for it here. And in this folder, we will have a couple of usual files, but what exactly you see here depends on how you have set up Orchard and what exactly is turned on. The most important thing here is, well, the app settings.json and the content definition.json files. These are basic configuration files for Orchard. App settings is, again, containing a lot of technical configuration of the tenant. Content definition.json contains, well, the content definition, all the content types and content part configurations. This can also be stored in the database. Just by default, you get it as a JSON file. And if you have set up the site with SQLite, then you will also get a yesSQL.db database file here. Of course, if you are using SQL Server, Postgre, or MySQL, those databases won't store anything here. Those databases will run on the database server. Furthermore, we also have a few things here for Lucene search indices if you are using it, and if you are using it in exactly this configuration. Yeah, like it's a status.json file and folders and files for the various search indices. And finally, there is also a media folder. Well, we have a couple of basic pictures here. The media folder is where all the static assets that you upload in the media library are stored, again, by default. So as I said multiple times, pretty much everything in Orchard is customizable and extensible. By default, you get such simple storage mechanisms that are still quite powerful and quite useful for a lot of websites. And if you need something else, sometimes there are alternatives built in. Sometimes you have to or can roll your own. In the case of media, for example, what's built in is this local file storage. Because, this is simple, good for a lot of things, a lot of scenarios, and runs pretty much anywhere. There is also a built-in option to use Azure Blob Storage, which is quite simple. You just have to turn it on and you have to configure it. But, of course, that's not necessary for everybody, hence the local media storage by default. But back to our solution. Apart from the web project here, we also have a couple of interesting folders here. Orchard is a framework and the CMS. When you are developing a full-blown web application with it, then this is a pretty seamless distinction because you are just using Orchard. But do note that several pieces of it come from the framework, from the underlying framework, which is more general and has less implementations. And a lot of things come from specific modules, which are more specific, both in their implementation and in their goals. And most of the all of the user-facing functionality and most of the functionality that actually fully runs something is implemented in modules. A lot of the plumbing is implemented in the framework. And in the Orchard core folder, we have those framework features, let's call it like that. You may notice that we have several such projects called or suffixed abstractions here. This means that these projects don't contain any implementations or just very basic ones. Mostly they contain interfaces. For example, the admin abstraction project contains, a basic service and a couple of very basic pieces of API that in themselves don't really do anything. So the abstractions projects don't do anything in themselves. There are always implementation projects correspondingly that actually implement the full functionality and hook up everything. Sometimes the functionality is in the framework itself, like for data access we have an abstractions project as well as the implementation project. But for a lot of things, we actually have modules. In frameworks, there is not much there, just an MVC-specific implementation. We have two module folders here. And remember when we have taken a look at the documentation and seen that there are core modules and CMS modules? Now, the same distinction is here. This is purely a logical distinction. The modules in these two folders are exactly the same technically. The only difference is that modules in the CMS folder deal with content with some kind of content management features, and modules in the non-CMS modules folder, they don't. We have a lot of functionality in both of these folders, and you see that a lot of things are here in the non-CMS folder, like a couple of things that we have already used. We have used admin because we have access to the admin area. We have used localization too, and we also have used workflows and a bit of user management. And we have used a lot of things from the CMS modules as well, of course. We have utilized admin menu, we have utilized content and content types extensively, and we also used, for example, menus, media, you name it. And here is Media Azure, as I mentioned, with support for Azure Blob Storage, which we didn't use, but you can check it out in the documentation how you can set it up if you would like to use it in Azure. Oh, and one more thing. You see here we have content localization, and we also have localization. Well, again, the distinction is that one is related to just content, and the other one is a more generic, more infrastructure-like core module. And apart from modules, we also have themes. Well, and we also have samples, but not much is there. We also have themes. Now, as we discussed previously, modules and themes are both plugins in Orchard. We call them extensions. The difference between modules and themes are largely semantic. Technically, they are very similar, and most of the things that you can do from a module, you can do from a theme, and vice versa. Not everything, but most of the things. The semantic distinction here is, though, that modules are more for pieces of functionality, and especially reusable pieces of functionality. It's very likely that if you create a module, you will actually use it in multiple applications. Whereas with themes, it's mostly about styling and look and feel. And it's not uncommon to only use a given theme just in one application. Themes are also modularized and can also be portable very well, so we can also use the same theme in multiple applications, but this is the general distinction. Long story short, if you are writing features, write it in a module. If you are creating styling and specifying the look and feel of the application, write it in a theme. And we have a couple of built-in themes. The admin is also driven by a theme. So you can also write your own admin theme, or just partially override what's coming from the built-in, the admin theme, and you can customize how the admin area looks like. And we have a couple of front-end themes as well. The block theme is a theme that we actually used during the previous examples, because we have set up the application with the blog recipe, which automatically configures the block theme. And if we take a look at it, we will see a basic structure, and I will just quickly go through it, because we'll look at these in great detail when we are actually creating our own, our first own extensions. In a theme, we commonly, well, in every extension, not just in a theme, we have a manifest file, which is, well, as the name also suggests, a lot of data that describes the extension itself. So as you can see, it also contains a human readable name. This is the one sometimes displayed on the admin area, as well as the description, and a few other pieces of metadata that we'll check out in detail later. It also contains a startup file or a startup class. This is not really Orchard specific. The idea is pretty much the same that you have in an ASP.NET Core web application in the root of it. Here you can configure injected services, application-wide things, tenant-wide things. So pretty much bootstrapping happens here. Well, it's in the name. We have a couple of other files that we won't really care about yet. And commonly we also have a www root or web root folder. If you put a file into the folder of a theme or a module, it won't be served on the internet. People from the outside won't be able to access them, and that's, of course, rightfully so. We don't want to open up everything. The web root folders are for actually serving public files and static files, talking about static files. This, as you can see, typically CSS, JavaScript files, graphic assets all go into the web root folder. Now, an easy approach is to actually just put them into the web root folder directly. And you can also make this a bit nicer and also more complicated by using some kind of static asset build pipeline like Gulp. And with that, you can not only build builds from languages compile to JavaScript or CSS, like from TypeScript or Sass, syntactically awesome style sheets. But you can also use a different structure where you are working with the files versus where the files are served from. So, for example, you can bundle files, you can mini-file files. Do know that the usefulness of those techniques also depends on whether you are using HTTP2, which you definitely should. Well, at least HTTP2. And these are the basic files and folders in a theme. Well, there are also views, and we will take a look at them in a lot more detail a bit later. Views are, well, MVC views. You may notice that there are actual liquid files, .liquid files, well, like this one. Again, this is written in liquid markup, and remember that I said that liquid is a first-class citizen in Orchard. You can write templates with it everywhere, as well as we are using it to substitute dynamic texts on the admin and configure string patterns. And as you can see, you can also write complete themes with it. Well, it depends on the knowledge of your team, what is suitable for you. I personally prefer Razor, which you can also see in all of the modules, as well as in the theme, for example. So the same content template is like this in Razor. It depends on your theme. Do note that you can use both of these. And how modules look like? Well, they are very similar. Let's take a quick look at actually the media module, and you will see that modules also have a manifest file. It serves exactly the same purpose as in themes, but you can also see that it also has some feature attributes here. Remember that I said that what you turn on from the admin are actually features, not modules, because features are individually are things in modules that you can individually turn on or off. Well, here they are actually defined. And similarly, modules also have a startup file, and they can have a web root folder as well, views folder, and folder for everything else. And actually, I mentioned Gulp pipeline and how you can put your assets not directly into the web root folder but somewhere else and build them. The media module actually does that. So we have an assets folder here with also SCSS, which of course can't be directly served but should be built. And those are built into the web root folder, into styles and a single style sheet. So, food for thought if you want to make things complicated, but also more efficient in the long run. There are two things that you have to know about modules and themes, which remain, is that what makes a C# project a module or a theme? Actually, not much. What you need for modules is a reference to orchardcore.module.targets. This is a project reference here because we are looking at the full source code, but there is also a corresponding NuGet package. And if you use the Orchard Core code generation templates or our scripts, this will also be added automatically to your module projects. This is pretty much that tells Orchard that, hey, this is a module. And do note that when you add the module, you also have to add it as a reference to the project. Of course, but you just do note that these projects are not somehow automatically discovered or anything like that. As you can see, themes are added here as well, and all the other projects are added here. Well, not necessarily each of them directly, but in the end transitively. And similarly, themes also have such a target file, which is, you might have guessed, theme.targets. Pretty much that's it. I highly encourage you to use a manifest file as well, at least, because, well, otherwise it will be very ugly on the admin for users. Otherwise, pretty much everything else is optional. Almost every time you also need a startup class. So that's another thing. But as you can see, it's very lightweight. And that is the basic structure of a full orchard solution. I, again, do encourage you to check it out and utilize the fact that Orchard is open source. The whole code base is at your fingertips. You can get an example for everything. Of course, there are blog posts out there. There is our train demo module out there. There are a lot of other examples, but, well, the most authoritative source is still the full Orchard source code. So I encourage you to actually make use of it.